All right, welcome to your own personal deep dive. Today we are tackling something you requested, how to grow a really amazing garden, but, without all the work.
Uh-huh.
You sent us the Lazy Gardener's Guide to a Healthy Garden from a website called Petit Garden Paradise.
Okay.
I gotta say, building a garden that basically takes care of itself, that's pretty interesting.
It's not really about being lazy. It's about working smarter and not harder. And I guess, yeah, kind of taking a few tips from nature.
Ah, so we're working with nature instead of against it.
Right.
I like that. The guide calls it the lazy gardener philosophy, but it really seems to be more about creating this system that uses the natural resilience of, nature, not just neglecting the garden.
Yeah, exactly. The guide, it kind of emphasizes this work less, grow more approach
Okay.
by designing a garden that just needs less from us, like less human intervention.
Less of us meddling with it.
Yeah, less meddling. And they even have this mantra, no weeding, no watering, no coddling.
Okay, wait, hold on. No watering. I mean, that sounds kind of extreme, especially coming from someone like me who's been basically trained to water everything like religiously.
Yeah,
But this guide, it challenges that idea, right?
it does.
Like how sometimes things like traditional drip irrigation systems can actually make the plants weaker.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. When a plant always has water right there, available at its roots, it doesn't have to, really dig deep
Yeah.
to search for that moisture, so it kind of becomes dependent.
So it's like you were babying them too much, making them, less able to survive on their own.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So this guide, it talks about this pretty fascinating way to make a garden bed.
Uh-huh.
It's called the log core method, and it's all about mimicking a forest floor.
That's right. It uses some permaculture principles. You basically start by layering logs, like fallen branches or rotting logs, or even like untreated wood scraps right at the bottom of your garden bed.
Now, I have to admit, this is where I get a little confused. How do logs actually help plants grow?
Okay, so as the logs break down, they decompose.
Okay.
And they become like this giant sponge, holding on to all that moisture and then slowly releasing it into the surrounding soil. It's like this natural irrigation system built in.
Ah, so no more dragging the hose around every day.
Nope.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it can actually keep those plants hydrated for months.
Wow. But what about the soil? I mean, do plants need more than just decomposing wood?
Of course. So on top of those logs, you add in some compost, some garden soil, and then a little sprinkle of crushed eggshells,
Okay.
especially if you're growing something like tomatoes that loves calcium. Then, to finish it off, you top it all off with a thick layer of straw mulch or shredded leaves.
Ah, so the mulch, it's kind of doing double duty, right? It's keeping the weeds down, but it's also like adding nutrients as it breaks down.
That's right.
It all sounds so efficient.
It is.
So what kinds of plants actually do well in a setup like this in a log core bed? I mean, I'm imagining things that can handle a little bit of tough love.
Yeah, you're on the right track. The guide actually mentions cherry tomatoes as
Yeah.
being perfect for this setup.
Okay.
They've got deep roots, so they can reach down into that moisture reservoir created by those logs, and they're known for producing a ton of tomatoes.
Yeah, cherry tomatoes are always a good choice. What about something a little, I don't know, less tomatoey?
Okay, well, the guide also highlights kale.
Okay.
It's known for being cold hardy and it can handle pests. So
Well,
it really fits in with that whole low maintenance style.
okay, so we've got cherry tomatoes, kale,
Yeah.
can't forget herbs, right?
Herbs are amazing for the lazy gardener.
Yeah.
Things like rosemary and thyme, they actually need very little water.
Mm-hmm.
And they do really well in an environment like this.
And, the guide even mentions that a little bit of stress, that can actually be good for plants.
It can.
How does that work?
Well, yeah, it seems kind of strange, right? Because we tend to think that we need to pamper our plants,
Yeah.
but a little stress can actually make them tougher. They develop stronger defense mechanisms,
Yeah.
like rosemary, for example.
Wow.
When it doesn't get as much water, it produces more of those fragrant oils.
Oh, interesting.
Makes it more flavorful and actually more resistant to pests.
So it's like a little tough love really does make them stronger.
Yeah.
I like that. Now, the guide also mentions this really unique way to choose the plants for this type of garden.
Uh-huh.
It's called the survival of the fittest test.
Right. It's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
It's basically letting your garden tell you what's going to work best where you are.
Interesting.
So you plant a bunch of different seedlings.
Okay.
And then, well, you just kind of ignore them for a while.
So we're letting natural selection do its thing.
Exactly.
The plants that make it, those are the ones that are the best fit for our lazy garden.
Yeah.
I'm really starting to like this whole approach.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But the guide, it goes beyond just individual plants. It really emphasizes building a whole thriving ecosystem.
Right.
So that means attracting those beneficial insects
Okay.
and making sure your soil is healthy and using things like companion planting.
Okay, let's talk about that. I'm really curious about companion planting. How does that work?
Okay.
And what are some good pairings if you're trying to be a lazy gardener?
All right. Companion planting, it's all about planting different types of plants together
Okay.
so that they can help each other out. Like a classic example, you plant marigolds next to your tomatoes.
Oh, okay.
Because marigolds, they repel nematodes. They're these tiny little worms that can damage tomato roots.
So the marigolds are like a natural pest control for the tomatoes.
Exactly.
Clever. Are there any other, like, dynamic duos that work well for the lazy garden?
Yeah. A really popular pairing is basil with peppers.
Okay.
Basil, it helps to deter aphids
Okay.
and other pests that like to munch on pepper plants.
Uh-huh.
Plus, it can actually make the peppers taste better.
Oh, bonus.
Yeah.
So marigolds with tomatoes, basil with peppers, anything else that can help keep those pests away naturally.
Garlic is amazing in the garden. It has that strong scent, and that can repel all kinds of pests.
Yeah.
So planting garlic near more delicate plants like roses or strawberries can help protect them.
So we're basically building this army of beneficial plants
We are.
to protect the garden. What about the soil itself?
Okay.
I mean, the guide mentions soil health, especially when it comes to like building the plant's immunity.
It's so important. Healthy soil, it's full of all these microbes and fungi that are really good for the plants.
Yeah.
And one way to help your soil is by doing no-till gardening, which means you're not digging or tilling the soil.
Oh, okay.
Because when you do that, you're kind of disrupting that whole delicate balance under the surface.
So instead of tilling, we're just layering that compost and mulch on top and just
Yeah.
letting nature do its thing.
Exactly. And the guide also talks about something called mycorrhizal fungi. Now, these are fungi that form this like partnership with plant roots.
Uh-huh.
They're like these little extensions of the roots.
Okay.
And they go out into the soil and they grab water and nutrients that the plant couldn't normally reach.
Wow, that's amazing. So by focusing on soil health, we're not just giving the plants more food, we're actually helping them develop stronger immune systems.
Exactly.
Awesome. And that leads us to a really interesting part of the guide where it talks about some common gardening myths.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it kind of like debunks those myths head on. So we've been talking about how important the soil is and how to create, a good, healthy ecosystem there. But this guide, it really dives into some common gardening myths, and that's where things get interesting. For instance, like it challenges the idea that we have to water our plants every single day.
Yeah, that's a big one. People tend to think they have to water all the time, but overwatering, it can actually do more harm than good.
I'm so guilty of this. Like I always feel like I need to keep that soil, moist. But the guide, it explains how that can lead to like really shallow root systems.
Right, exactly. When the water's always there, right at the surface, the roots don't have any reason to grow deep.
Yeah.
So if we let the soil dry out a little bit between waterings, it encourages those roots to like really go deep and search for that moisture.
So deeper roots, that means stronger plants.
Exactly. Stronger, more resilient plants.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
The guide, it even uses this example of dry farm tomatoes. Have you ever had those?
Oh, they're amazing.
They are so good.
Yeah, dry farm tomatoes, they're known for their flavor. It's so intense.
Yeah, and their skins are thicker too.
Yes,
And that's because they've had to work harder to survive, right?
exactly.
They've developed those deep roots and they haven't been, constantly watered, so they have to kind of like toughen up.
They've had to adapt.
Yeah. This is making me rethink my whole watering routine.
I know, right?
And speaking of like challenging the way we think about things, the guide also talks about how, not all weeds are bad.
Yeah. The war on weeds.
The never-ending battle.
It's a battle a lot of gardeners feel like they have to fight. But the lazy gardener, it's a different approach.
Yeah. I have to admit, I'm pretty quick to pull up any weed I see. But the guide suggests that some weeds can actually be good for the garden. I mean, we already talked about clover and how it, helps put nitrogen into the soil.
Right.
But what about dandelions? I mean, they're considered a weed for a reason, right?
Well, the guide actually points out that dandelions can be helpful too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, their roots, they go really deep down and they bring up nutrients from way down there. And then when they decompose, all those nutrients go right back into the top layer of the soil. So it
Okay.
makes the soil richer for other plants.
So instead of like, waging war on every single dandelion we see, maybe we should appreciate them a little bit.
Maybe give them a little nod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a different way of thinking about things.
It is, for sure. And it's kind of like this bigger idea of mimicking how things work in nature, where having lots of different plants and stuff is actually a good thing.
It's all about diversity.
Exactly.
Diversity.
The guide also talks about another thing that, like, a lot of gardeners believe in,
Uh-huh.
that you need to use fertilizers.
Yeah.
But it says that using those chemical fertilizers, it can create a dependency. It's like giving your plants junk food.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
Those chemical fertilizers, they give a quick boost, but they don't really do anything for the long-term health of the soil.
And they can actually mess up the balance of, the good microbes in the soil.
Yeah, they can. It's like giving someone a sugar rush instead of a healthy meal. It doesn't last.
Right, exactly. So the guide is saying a better approach is to focus on making that soil fertile naturally, like with compost and mulch.
Yes. Compost and mulch, they're like this slow-release fertilizer.
Okay.
They break down over time, giving those plants a nice, steady supply of food. So it's a more sustainable way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
More holistic.
Exactly.
So the guide is challenging a lot of things we think about gardening, like overwatering,
Yeah.
weeding all the time,
Right.
and using fertilizers. It's
Right.
making us rethink things.
It is. It's about working with nature, not against it,
Yeah.
and creating a garden that can basically take care of itself.
So like we talked about, those self-mulching systems, right?
Yeah.
Where you let the leaves and plant debris decompose, and it creates its own natural mulch.
Right. That's a great example.
And then there's the whole idea of biodiversity, having lots of different plants attracts those beneficial insects, the ones that keep the pests under control.
Exactly. It's all connected.
It really is. It's like we're creating this whole web of life.
You are. And it all comes back to the guide's advice about starting small.
Right. Don't try to change everything at once.
Just pick a little area, maybe build a log core bed or plant some herbs that don't need a lot of water, like rosemary and thyme.
And the guide, it also talks about changing our mindset, right? It's not about being perfect.
No.
It's about like embracing the imperfections.
Exactly. A lazy garden. It's not about perfectly straight rows and stuff.
Yeah.
It's about celebrating how wild and diverse nature is.
I love that. It's like a garden with personality.
Yes.
And the guide even challenges us to try this 30-day ignore test.
Oh, yes. That's a fun one.
I know, right? You pick a plant, you stick it in the ground, and then you just completely ignore it for 30 days.
You just walk away.
No watering, no weeding, nothing. I mean, isn't that a little extreme? What if it really needs some help?
Well, that's kind of the point.
Okay.
It's about really testing the limits and seeing how tough those plants can be.
Okay.
You might be surprised.
They might do better than we think.
They often do. Much better.
Okay. And if they don't survive?
Well, you've still learned something, right?
Okay.
You've learned what that plant can and can't handle.
So it's a win-win either way. Either the plant shows us how tough it is, or we learn what it needs to really thrive. I'm starting to think that this lazy gardener idea, it's not just about the techniques, it's about changing the way we think about gardening.
I think you're absolutely right. It's about shifting from this idea of controlling everything
Yeah.
to working together with nature and trusting the process.
Trusting nature, trusting the plants, and maybe even trusting ourselves a little more.
I love that. And that trust, that willingness to let go a little, it can actually make gardening more enjoyable, more peaceful.
I can see that. So we've covered a lot here, but as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, what are some of the main things our listeners should remember, like some key takeaways for their lazy gardening journey?
Well, first, remember that philosophy. Work less, grow more.
Right.
Design your garden to be low maintenance. Choose plants that are tough and trust that nature knows what it's doing.
Okay.
Start small, pay attention, and don't be afraid to experiment.
And maybe most importantly, remember that gardening should be fun.
It should be.
Relax. Let nature take the lead.
Yeah.
And let your lazy garden grow.
Yes. And who knows, maybe this whole approach, this idea of letting go a little, maybe it'll start to affect other parts of our lives too.
That's a great thought to leave our listener with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Happy gardening. There's more to it than just letting things go wild, right?
Right.
The guide, it reminds us that lazy gardening, that doesn't mean your garden has to be messy or ugly.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we do both? Like, keep it low maintenance, but also make it look nice. Because I got to admit, sometimes when I just, let nature do its thing, it can end up looking a little chaotic.
Yeah, it can. It's all about design, really.
Oops.
Remember the guy talks about design over effort.
Yeah, yeah.
So if we put a little thought into it up front, like how we want things to look and what plants we choose, we can have a garden that's beautiful and easy to care for.
So we're being intentional about our laziness.
Uh,
I like that. We talked about those log core beds, how they can cut down on work.
yeah.
But what are some other things we can do that, fit the lazy gardener style, but also make the garden look nicer?
Well, we already mentioned edible flowers, right?
Oh, yeah, right.
They add a pop of color, they attract pollinators, and they're pretty low maintenance.
Right. Like calendula or nasturtiums.
Yes. Those are good ones.
What about other plants that look good and don't need a lot of attention and, play well with others?
Hmm. The guide actually suggests fig trees.
Oh, okay.
Once they get going, they basically take care of themselves.
Wow.
And their leaves are so big, they create all this shade.
Yeah.
So weeds don't really stand a chance. Plus, they just look really cool, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, they've got that, like, sculptural look.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. Form and function. Any other suggestions?
How about plants with interesting leaves?
Okay.
Like hostas. They come in all sorts of shapes and colors.
Oh, yeah.
So they add a lot of visual interest, even when they're not blooming. And bonus, they're super low maintenance.
That's a good point. It's easy to focus on the flowers, but the leaves can be just as pretty.
Totally.
So we've got our design figured out. We've picked out our plants. But even in a lazy garden, there are going to be times when we have to do some work, right? So how do we handle that without, giving up on the whole laid-back approach?
The most important thing is to just observe before you do anything.
Okay.
So, instead of jumping into action the second you see a problem, just take a minute to, figure out what's going on.
So let's say I see some aphids on one of my plants.
Okay.
I don't need to immediately grab the insecticide.
Nope. A lot of times, nature will take care of it on its own.
Okay.
You might see some ladybugs show up, ready to eat those aphids. Or maybe the plant itself is strong enough to handle a few little bugs.
It's about having faith in that ecosystem, that it can balance itself out. And if we do need to step in and do something, we should choose methods that, fit with this whole philosophy.
Right. So instead of chemical fertilizers, use compost or mulch.
Yeah.
And if you have to get rid of weeds, try hand pulling them or covering them with mulch instead of using herbicides.
Always working with nature, not against it.
I have to ask about that 30-day ignore test again.
Okay.
It's such a cool idea, but part of me is still a little nervous about it. It just feels wrong to completely ignore a plant for that long.
I know what you mean.
Uh,
But think of it as, like, an experiment. It's a chance to really see how tough plants can be.
okay.
You might be surprised by how well they do, even without any help from us.
Yeah, maybe. And what if they don't make it?
Well, then you've still learned something.
Okay.
You figured out, where that plant's limits are. And that can help you make better choices in the future.
So no matter what happens, we're learning something. I really like that. I'm starting to see how this lazy gardener thing, it's not just about techniques and stuff.
It's about how we think about gardening.
It is. It's about changing our perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, like instead of trying to control every little thing,
Right.
we learn to trust and collaborate.
Exactly. Trusting nature, trusting the plants, and maybe even trusting ourselves a little more.
I love that. And that trust, that letting go, it can actually make gardening more fun.
It can, absolutely. And it can bring a sense of peacefulness to the whole experience.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the main things our listeners should remember?
Well, remember that philosophy. Work less, grow more.
Yes.
Design your garden to be low maintenance. Pick plants that are tough and resilient and have faith in nature.
Okay.
Start small, pay attention to what's happening in your garden, and don't be afraid to try things out.
Great advice.
Yeah.
And maybe most importantly, remember to have fun with it.
Yes.
Relax, let nature lead the way, and let your lazy garden thrive.
Beautifully said. And who knows, maybe this whole idea, this lazy gardener approach, maybe it can help us find more balance and ease in other areas of our lives too.
That's a wonderful thought to leave our listener with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into lazy gardening.
Happy gardening!